is so vast that it is even visible from space. The river cuts northeast India's biggest state, Assam, into two halves. Every year, Assam sees major floods, and you probably see that in news. Lives are lost, millions get displaced, villages, crops, and even basic infrastructure get destroyed. But what does Brahmaputra have to do with Assam floods? A lot, thanks to geography. The Brahmaputra is both a lifeline and a threat to Assam. It is a huge river system of multiple channels and water bodies, crisscrossing large parts of the state. This should be good news, right? But no, it isn't. The glacial melt in summer coincides with the monsoon, intensifying downstream, causing the annual flooding. But this is a natural phenomenon for this region. There was a time when people welcomed the first flooding of the year, as it made lands more fertile. However, the excess flow of water becomes a problem when it brings along disaster. Successive governments in Assam have spent 30,000 crore over the last 60 years in building embankments along Brahmaputra. US civil engineer Charles Elliott Jr. cautioned in 19th century, embankments confine rivers and cause them to rise higher and flow faster. Elliott was ignored back then, but today experts echo him. Take for example Dibrugarh, which has a massive embankment that protects it from floodwater. But Patragaon, which lies where these embankments end, does not have that luxury. So when floods come, while these embankments protect Dibrugarh, it channels the floodwater in greater volume and intensity towards Patragaon. While one is saved, the other is left to deal with a double whammy. That's when the flood becomes a disaster. So why build embankments then? Some say it's just politics rather than policy. Think about that. And what more, landslides and faulty drainage have weakened these embankments. 80% of them are also poorly maintained. Here's a simple equation. Human factor plus climate change is equal to flood disaster. With encroachment of river banks, more and more people are living close to the river, risking their lives to floods. Rampant deforestation and hill cutting have only worsened the situation. Not to forget, the impact of climate change on eastern Himalayas as glaciers melt faster. And what's the human and material cost? On an average, the flood kills 50 people every year. In 2012 alone, the floods cost Assam 3,200 crore. The state loses around 8,000 square kilometers of land to erosion due to flooding every year. And what about animals? It is said that the flooding is essential for the survival of Kaziranga National Park, world famous for its one-horned rhinos. The floods revitalize the grasslands. Earlier, the animals could simply move to higher ground within the park. But in 2019, as 90% of Kaziranga saw flooding, the water inundated every inch of the park, including the higher ground. Suddenly, the animals had nowhere to go. The number of animal deaths have been alarming. Did you know? Floods now kill more one-horned rhinos at Kaziranga than poachers. So, is there a solution? The Brahmaputra cannot be tamed. Flooding will become more intense in years to come. But how do we minimize the destruction? Himanshu Thakur suggests information about flood forecasts must reach the affected villages in time. Strengthen only those embankments that are really needed. And do not build more embankments. Ban all construction on low-lying floodplains. Perhaps it's time we stop normalizing the yearly destruction and act, not react.
And yet this is not a one-off year. Assam suffers floods every year. There are 10 major rivers flowing through the state. Brahmaputra is the largest. It is also one of the biggest in Asia. The river flows from Tibet, goes through India before entering Bangladesh. Then there is the Barak River. Over the decades, people have built their houses around these rivers. They've profited from the fertile land. Minor floods have happened every couple of years. They've enhanced the soil's fertility and people have not complained. But now these floods have become major. The rivers have become flood prone. and Assam has become one of the most flood-prone states in this country. 40% of the state is at risk of flooding. This is 4 times the national mark. Assam has nearly 10% of India's flood-prone land. How did this happen? Let's start with climate change. Today, even on a normal day, the Brahmaputra has more water than usual. This is because the glacier in Tibet is melting. Come early monsoon, there are torrential rains in these states. Then there are neighboring hill states, Arunachal Pradesh and Meghalaya. When it rains in these states, the water flows into Assam. And before you know it, the river is flowing above the danger mark, and it does not take too long for it to breach its banks. The muddy banks have been eroded by decades of human activity. 4.27 lakh hectares of the state has been eroded by flood since 1950. All of these factors make Assam's rivers more prone to flooding. So every time the Brahmaputra or any of these rivers breaks the banks, Assam ends up looking like this. In 2021, this was the picture. Also in 2020.
The situation had been a little grim because there had been heavy rainfall since the past few days, and the whole of Assam is inundated, and the quantum depends, it varies from place to place.
Today, every river in Assam is flowing above the danger mark. This year, the situation is especially bad. Many say it's the worst they've seen in their lifetime. Our reporter has been on ground for a few days now, telling the story of some of the most affected areas. He sent us a quick update using a car headlight because the flood has snapped the power supply.
The overall flood situation in Indian northeastern state of Assam is very bad. Around 48 lakh people were affected by the floods. 10 people have died in last 24 hours. Indian Army and NDRF are working together with the state forces.
Well, you can blame nature and climate change for these floods. Who do you blame for the casualties? It's not that the flood is killing these people. It's the lack of preparedness. In 1980, a Brahmaputra board was set up. It was to come up with measures to control floods. The board suggested that dams and reservoirs be built in the state. What happened then? Critics say while the dams were constructed, they were not built keeping the state's ecology in mind. You see, what Assam needs urgently is an integrated flood forecasting, warning and response system. In 2014, India signed an agreement with China. Beijing agreed to provide crucial flood data on the Brahmaputra. This was in exchange for $8.2 million every year. But can India continue to rely on China for something so crucial? It must build its own capabilities, its own models for flood prediction. People need to be warned well in advance. If required, they need to be rehabilitated for good. India must do all it can to put an end to this yearly mayhem.